Hello, everyone. I'm your storyteller tonight. I know many of you come here, in this quiet space, to listen to the whispers from the darkness, the stories that can send chills down your spine, but somehow lull you into a deep sleep. Perhaps it is that contrast, that gentle thrill between safety and fear, that is the most effective sedative. So, find yourself a comfortable position. Turn off the lights if you want. Let the darkness embrace you like a familiar blanket. Take a deep breath and exhale slowly. Feel your body relax, your mind gradually drifting away from the chaos of everyday life. Tonight, I will take you to forgotten places, hidden corners of reality where fear does not need a specific shape but still creeps into every breath. The story I am about to tell is not a single event, but a series of obsessions, fragments of memories that seem unrelated but are strung together by an invisible thread of insecurity, a presence that is always lurking somewhere, right at the edge of sight. Let's start from an old office building where silence does not bring peace but hides something heavy. Waiting, I still remember the feeling of the stagnant, heavy air in that old office building that seemed to cling tightly to my skin from the moment I entered. My name is Eric, a freelance IT analyst. My work often takes me to places like this, buildings in transition, spaces left behind by development, where old servers need to be dismantled, data needs to be backed up one last time before everything is forgotten. This building used to be the administrative headquarters of a large corporation. But the golden age is over. They downsized many years ago, leaving behind a dusty maze of rows of empty desks, abandoned meeting rooms, and an atmosphere thick with the smell of old paper, rotting carpet, and something indescribably fishy. The hallway walls are painted a dull gray, a color so dreary that it feels more like a warning than an aesthetic choice. From the beginning, I felt something was wrong, as if this place itself was silently protesting my presence. I told myself it was just the pressure of starting a new task, that my imagination was working too hard. After all, my job is just to deal with outdated hardware, reorganize the system, completely logical things, nothing scary. On the first day, when I was struggling to move some old monitors into storage, some of the building's maintenance staff briefly mentioned the top floor, where the decommissioned meeting rooms were. They said in a half-joking tone that people sometimes hear heavy footsteps at night, the sound of doors banging even though no one is there. They called it the presence upstairs. Their eyes looked a bit serious when they mentioned it, although they immediately tried to laugh it off, telling me not to wander around there alone at night. They don't look like they're joking at all. I try to laugh along, brushing those words away. I'm someone who works with logic, with cables, hard drives, and code, not with silly ghost stories. But all my rational confidence began to waver the second night I worked there. I needed to restart one of the old servers that was still running, so I had to stay late, well past midnight. The whole building seemed to exhale emptiness. Every hallway became dark tunnels, only weakly lit by a few flickering, about to fail fluorescent lights. The sound of my shoes echoed lonely on the floor. And then, I became aware of the strange smell more clearly. A mixture of old, musty carpet and something pungent and sour that I couldn't identify. The server room, unfortunately, is located near the stairs leading to the top floor. As I was walking towards it, I heard a very clear thud from above. The sound was like someone had just dropped a heavy box. My chest tightened. The thud repeated, this time more rhythmic, like footsteps going back and forth. I reassured myself that it was just the creaking of the old structure, or maybe the building's ventilation system was working. But my heart was beating so hard that I had to stop and try to take a deep breath. After completing the server reboot, I decided to quickly finish my work and leave. I was almost out the main door of that floor when I heard a door upstairs slam shut. The sound was sudden and violent, echoing down the stairs. My stomach turned. My body tensed up. Cold sweat began to form at my temples. My instincts told me to run, but I forced myself to stay calm. Logically, the place should be completely empty. No one was scheduled to work on that floor, and security must have locked the door hours ago. But I couldn't ignore the fact that something or someone had just slammed the door. I tried to convince myself that perhaps a window somewhere upstairs had been left ajar, creating a draft. But looking along the hallway where I was standing, all the windows were tightly closed. With no intention of investigating, I hastily turned off the lights in the server room and headed downstairs. On the way, I felt a sudden surge of panic. The ceiling light flickered again, just once, but enough to make me choke. In that moment of light flashing and then going out, I had the uneasy feeling that a tall figure was standing at the end of the distant hallway. I couldn't see any details, just the shape of something absurdly tall and motionless. My heart was pounding like it was about to explode. I could barely breathe. But when the light stabilized again, the place was completely empty. I left the building in a state of near panic, not daring to look back. That night, I could hardly sleep. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Perhaps the silhouette was just an illusion created by exhaustion and poor lighting. I told myself I needed to rest more and stop letting old ghost stories invade my thoughts. But the next day, when I cautiously told what I had saw a female colleague who worked there part-time, she turned pale. She recounted rumors of a tall, looming presence that some employees had glimpsed. She described it as a long shadow, often lurking near the corners of the hallway, always watching, never coming close. A feeling of nausea rose in my throat as I listened to her speak. That description is too specific to be dismissed as a mere optical illusion. Over the next week, every time I had to work late, I found myself dreading entering that building. My palms were sweaty as soon as I entered the lobby. The low hum of the fluorescent lights made me feel uneasy. However, work required me to stay, as certain server checks had to be done outside of business hours to avoid disrupting daytime operations. And ironically, the oldest hardware is stored on the very floor that everyone avoids. I often stand in front of the elevator door for a long time, then choose to take the stairs. There's something about stepping into a sealed metal box that makes me feel more vulnerable. Most nights, I only hear small noises that can be ignored, such as the sound of the building sinking, the sound of metal creaking here and there, the sound of wind whistling through old windows. But there are times when I hear footsteps very clearly above my head. Heavy, deliberate footsteps seem to be circling the perimeter of the upper floor. Every time that happens, my chest tightens and I break out in a cold sweat. My mouth was dry, and I often held my breath, waiting, hoping the sound would stop. They usually stop, but the silence that follows is sometimes worse. It was like waiting for the next heartbeat of something huge and hidden. One night, I tried to get another coworker to go upstairs with me, just to have some company. But she insisted that she was too busy with her own work. I almost begged, but in the end, I still had to go alone. I remember gripping the stair railing so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The hallway lights flicker more than usual. My ears seemed hypersensitive to every little sound. The faint buzzing of electricity, the sound of my own shoes scraping the floor, and the pounding of blood in my ears. When I opened the door leading into the main hallway of the top floor, an urge to run away immediately overwhelmed me. The atmosphere here was thick, as if the air itself carried a menacing weight. I smelled that pungent smell again, a mix of burning plastic and rotting drywall. My stomach growled, and I swallowed hard, determined to finish the job quickly. As I moved to retrieve a few old routers from a dusty room, I caught something in the reflection of the glass wall separating this room from the next. It was that tall figure again, standing at the other end of the hallway, motionless, staring at me. I froze, a reflex that made my entire body stiffen, my breath stuck in my throat. For a moment that seemed to last forever, I couldn't take my eyes off that reflection. Then, without warning, the figure took a step back, and the reflection disappeared. I turned around, but there was nothing there. There was just an empty hallway with outdated furniture piled haphazardly. By this time, my nerves were as tight as strings. I felt an uncomfortable mix of terror and curiosity, but mostly I just wanted to get out of there. My mind raced with questions. Was it a trick of the overhead lights? Am I hallucinating due to stress? The feeling that something was watching me, that it could appear anywhere, at any time, gnawed at me endlessly. The other colleagues didn't seem to care, content to believe it was just part of the building's ghost story. But I know what I saw. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a shadow. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding looking toward the stairs leading upstairs. Every time I pass by it, I feel my chest tighten. That feeling of being watched returns. At night, if forced to stay, every echo, every creak seems to be amplified 100 times. There were also times when I heard a faint whisper, though I couldn't make out any words, just the low, persistent hum of something not quite human. My body reacted with an adrenaline shock. My heart pounded against my chest. My hands and feet turned cold. The supervisors started asking me if I was okay. I tried to vaguely explain that this place was affecting me, that the work environment felt claustrophobic. They offered to let me adjust my work hours, perhaps coming in earlier in the evening so I could leave before midnight. But a few tasks still needed to be completed in the early morning hours, and inevitably, I found myself alone in that place again. One particularly disturbing night, I was in the second-floor server room, running a software update at around 2 a.m. I heard an upstairs door slam 3 times in a row. The sound was so loud that I felt it vibrate in my chest. My throat closed up, and I almost dropped the flashlight. The temptation to run was too great, but I remembered that the servers were in the middle of a major update in half an hour. If I leave now, it could crash the entire system. So I had to stay. Every minute that passes feels like a century. The next few minutes passed in eerie silence, and I almost convinced myself that perhaps the wind had blown through an open window. Then, right above my head, I heard what sounded like rapid footsteps running across the floor. They stopped near the edge of the hallway, right above me, before dashing back in the opposite direction. My breathing was shallow, my heart beating like a war drum. I could understand how a living person could move so quickly and crazily across a completely empty floor. When the software update was finally completed, I hurriedly packed my things and headed downstairs to get out. The hallway light flickered again. My whole body trembled with fear. I heard a faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging on metal, coming from upstairs. I had to fight the primal instinct to run away. In that moment, it was as if the building itself was coming to life, demanding my fear as a price for the trespass. My veins pounded in my ears, and my vision blurred. By the time I reached the front door, my hands were shaking so much I could barely swipe the keycard. Finally, the lock clicked, and I stumbled out, gasping for fresh air like a drowning man. After that night, I seriously considered quitting my job. I told the agency that this project was beyond my capabilities, but they insisted that the client was very satisfied with my work and offered me a raise if I stayed a little longer. They need a final inventory and hardware disposal plan. Against my wisdom, I agreed, but I swore to myself never to venture upstairs alone at night again. However, a few evenings later, circumstances forced me to break that promise. A series of system errors require a manual reboot, and these errors always appear at the worst times. Around 11:45 p.m., I found myself standing in front of that damn staircase again, telling myself that I could make this quick and get out. My mind was fighting adrenaline. All senses were heightened, and the building felt unusually still. Climbing the stairs, I kept seeing movement in my peripheral vision, shadows flickering just out of sight. My skin was covered in goosebumps, and my heart was pounding in my chest. The rooftop hallway was darker than usual. A few lights were completely turned off, leaving long stretches of darkness. I used a flashlight, but it only seemed to illuminate a narrow path, leaving the rest of the hallway in oppressive darkness. As I approached the final conference room, the door creaked and opened on its own. My breath caught. The darkness behind that door seemed alive, a tangible force weighing heavily on my senses. Then I heard something, a throaty wheezing sound, as if someone or something was struggling to breathe. My legs almost gave out, but I forced myself forward, pushing open the door with a shaking hand. Inside, the air was colder than the rest of the floor, and the constant feeling of being watched weighed heavily on me. I shined a flashlight around, and that's when I noticed the reflection in the large glass panel at the back of the room. The tall figure was there again, looming absurdly. My chest constricted as I watched it raise what looked like an arm. and arms so long it couldn't have been human. My entire body stiffened from panic. I wanted to scream, but my voice seemed locked in my throat. I staggered back, tripping over a pile of cables, and the flashlight clattered to the floor. In the chaotic moments that followed, I crawled to pick it up, swinging the beam of light frantically around the room. The figure has disappeared. I'm not sure if that makes me feel more reassured or more terrified. Something inside me shattered at that moment. Fear gave way to a shock of desperate determination. I ran out of the room, slammed the door behind me, and rushed down the hallway. My lungs burned, and my vision blurred with tears of pure terror. It felt as if the building itself was vibrating with malice. Each step I took echoed a millisecond slower, as if something was following, imitating it perfectly. When I reached the stairs, my knees were shaking and I almost collapsed. I forced myself to go down, step by painful step, feeling as if I were descending into another world rather than escaping. When I finally rushed out into the ground floor lobby, I was shaking so violently that I could barely control my body. My mind raced with questions. Was the entity real, or had I gone crazy from stress and lack of sleep? Why is it following me? And why does it lurk in reflections? The disturbing possibility that it was feeding on my fears lingered in my mind. I left that night and never came back alone again. I negotiated to only work during the day, firmly refusing any night duties. The supervisors were not happy, but they agreed, perhaps because they saw the horror written all over my face. Whenever they asked about the presence upstairs, I just said I wanted nothing to do with it. Even remembering those memories makes my heart pound. Finally, the work is over. I completed the assignment, signed the inventory, and moved on to the next contract. But the echoes of that building have never left me. To this day, I still catch myself glancing at reflective surfaces in unfamiliar hallways, half expecting, half dreading to see that absurdly tall figure standing there, watching. Sometimes at night, I hear noises in my own house that remind me of footsteps pounding overhead. I would jump up in bed, my breathing quickening, my heart pounding, until I reminded myself where I was. However, a nagging doubt remains. Did I escape that presence, or did it follow me? I cannot say for sure. All I know is that whenever I recall the stagnant air, the flickering lights, and that shadowy figure, a chill runs down my spine that no amount of reassurance can erase. I left that place alive without physical harm, but a nagging insecurity still haunted me, a fragment of that old office embedded in my mind. Sometimes I wonder if the darkness I encounter is merely a reflection of my own stress and anxiety, or if that building actually hides something far more sinister than a haunted legend. In any case, I still haven't found a clear explanation, only a lingering fear. And whenever I hear a door slam or see a fleeting movement in the hallway, I can't help but remember that place and its silent observer, waiting in the dark. The obsession from the old office building gradually subsided, or at least I tried to convince myself that it did. Work took me away again, business trips to strange towns, places where comfort often had to give way to affordability. And it was during one such trip that horror found me again, this time in a different, more subtle and terrifying form. I can still remember the suffocating silence of that night, the kind of silence that settled so thickly in the air, like a damp blanket you can't shake off. The house we rented for a business trip loomed out of the darkness, its old shutters creaking in an almost regular rhythm. No wind touched the tall trees outside, but somehow they still seemed to sway, as if caught in a silent storm. The porch light flickered, creating uncertain dancing shadows on the warped wooden planks. Even before I set foot inside, something told me something was wrong, as if the whole place was holding its breath, waiting to exhale the moment we let our guard down. I arrived in this small town early that afternoon, along with my colleague who was accompanying me as part of work. We were both commercial representatives, and our work often took us to remote places where we would stay wherever was cheap and available. This time, we booked a modest house located on the edge of a winding country road. It's away from the main square, which means the streets are emptier and darker than anything I'm used to. The first impression of the house is not entirely unpleasant. It's quaint in an old-fashioned way, with a wooden exterior that shows signs of age but still retains a certain rustic charm. There were no immediate signs of the terrible night to come, but I remember feeling a vague unease in the pit of my stomach as I entered. Inside, there was a faint smell of stagnant air, as if no one had lived there for quite some time. The floor creaked with every step, and the walls seemed too bare, with only a few outdated photos and a mirror in the hallway. My colleague chose the smaller bedroom near the front window, while I took the slightly larger room in the back. We had spent a long day on the road, and were looking forward to resting before meeting our clients in the morning. Before going to bed, we decided to make a quick run to a local grocery store a few blocks away to buy some snacks and drinks. It was during that short trip that something began to change. The grocery store was almost empty. A few flickering fluorescent bulbs illuminated the walkways, but the rest was in eerie darkness, as if half the bulbs had burned out long ago. My colleague and I walked through the aisles, noticing how limited the merchandise was. It feels almost apocalyptic to see so many empty store shelves. However, we still picked up a few bags of chips, a few cans of soda, and some bottled water. I tried to shake off the strange feeling the store gave me, attributing it to the late hour and my own fatigue. It never occurred to me that someone else might be watching us. When we got back to the house, we put the groceries on the kitchen table. A single ceiling light bulb emitted a weak light, barely reaching the corners of the room. The kitchen countertops were a tired yellow color, and the kitchen cabinets were slightly askew, revealing peeling paint and dull handles. My colleague suggested that we rest to feel refreshed for the next day. I nodded in agreement, feeling relieved at the thought of lying down. But that relief only lasted for a moment. Right after we separated and went to our separate rooms, I felt a slight vibration in my pocket. Checking my phone, I saw a text message from an unknown number. The content made my heart skip a beat. It mentioned the brand of potato chips I just bought, followed by details about the flavor my coworker liked. At first, I thought it must be someone on our work communications team playing a prank. Perhaps a colleague saw us on the street and wanted to tease us. But my chest tightened because I had never mentioned that particular snack to anyone. My coworker and I were only in that store for about 5 minutes, talking quietly about what kind of fries we liked. Trying to stay calm, I went to my colleague's door and knocked lightly. We talked in whispers through the slightly open door, both confused. He told me to ignore it, that it was probably a random scam message. He half-jokingly said that sometimes there are coincidences, especially in small towns where local phone numbers are reused. Even though I tried to sound nonchalant, I could still hear the insecurity in his voice. We agreed to put our phones on silent and go to sleep. I returned to my room. The bed was rickety and covered with old-fashioned sheets that gave off a faint smell of mothballs. I found myself lying awake, tension curled tightly in my stomach. It was impossible to shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, had been watching us in that grocery store, or perhaps even before that. My phone vibrated again. This time, the message described how I was pacing around the room, looking nervous. My pulse pounded as I read those words. I stared at the corners of the ceiling, searching for any hidden cameras, any sign of tampering. Nothing. My colleague spoke through the wall that he also felt like something was wrong in his room, although he didn't go into detail. I paced for a while longer, not sure what to do next, deciding that it was probably best to confront the messages directly. I typed a reply to the unknown number, demanding to know who they were and why they were sending these intrusive messages. My palms became clammy, and a chill ran down my spine as my phone vibrated again. I hesitated before looking. The new message simply read that I shouldn't worry because everything was under control and that I'd better stay awake. At that moment, I became aware of the profound silence in the house. There was no sound from the street, no hum of distant cars or passing motorbikes. Even the usual night insects seemed to have disappeared. My throat was dry, and each breath required conscious effort. I wandered out into the hallway, thinking I could go to the kitchen to get a glass of water. The hallway was darker than before, as if the single overhead light had dimmed. My footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, a hollow echo that made my skin crawl. As I approached the stove, I noticed a faint movement out of the corner of my eye. The curtains in the living room, which I had left open earlier, were fluttering gently. Even though no breeze came through the closed windows, they swayed in a gentle but unmistakable pattern, as if guided by invisible hands. The pit in my stomach deepened. I turned on the light in the living room, only to see the bulb flicker once and then go out. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. In the dim light from the kitchen, I saw the curtain stop, falling softly against the window frame. I told myself it must be some oddity of the old house, perhaps a vent or some gap in the wall. Desperate for any semblance of normalcy, I went into the kitchen and turned on the faucet to fill my glass. The handle feels stiff, and the water takes a few seconds to come out. It was warm, and the pipes groaned as if dissatisfied with my need for water. After the first sip, the overhead light flickered again. In that split second between morning and night, I saw something flash across the hallway. Something tall and dim. I almost dropped the glass. My heart was beating so fast, I thought I might pass out. I told myself it was just my imagination, a flicker of light playing tricks on me. But I felt a change in the atmosphere, as if the air itself had become heavier. The phone in my pocket vibrated again. My fingers trembled as I read another text message. That water won't help. You'll stay awake anyway. My chest tightened, and cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My colleague was probably experiencing the same horror in his own room, but we agreed not to frighten each other further. Against my better judgment, I snuck back to my bedroom, closed the door behind me, and turned the lock with shaking hands. Time passed painfully slowly. Every creak of the floor seemed amplified. Every change in the wind outside sounded like footsteps. And then there was the sound of the sink in the bathroom. At first it was just a faint dripping sound, then a stronger flowing sound, as if someone had turned the faucet all the way up. My mind was spinning. Is my colleague awake yet? Is the faucet broken? However, I couldn't muster the courage to step out into that hallway again, at least not right away. I leaned against the bedroom door, pressing my ear against the wood. The sound of running water continued. Then it stopped suddenly. I felt an urge to check, if only to confirm that I hadn't lost control of reality. Forcing myself to turn the doorknob, I ventured out into the hallway again. My legs feel weak. I approached the bathroom door and saw the light was already on. The sink was still dripping, water droplets rattling on the porcelain, even though the faucet was closed. Water continued to leak out, forming a small puddle around the drain hole. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face was pale. Sweat was forming on my temples. My eyes were wide open with confusion and fear. Then my phone vibrated again, making my heart jump. Another message. Check the mirror more closely. A feeling of nausea rose within me. I glanced at my reflection again, noticing how distorted it looked. My features seemed subtly distorted, as if the mirror's surface wasn't perfectly flat. I stepped closer and saw the overhead lights flicker, warping my reflection in ways that defy physics. It could have been an optical illusion, a trick of old glass and malfunctioning electricity, but in that moment, it felt as if the mirror was alive, or at least haunted by something that thrived on my terror. A sudden rustling sound made me turn around. The hallway behind me was empty, but I was sure something had been there just a second ago. My legs shook, and my breathing became shallow. I retreated to my room, locked the door, and leaned against it. The messages kept coming, even though I tried to ignore them. They described my every move, how I'm standing, how fast my breathing is, even the way my hands keep shaking. Whoever sent these messages had their eyes on me. Or worse, they were in my head. I can't decide which possibility is scarier. Around this time, my colleague gently knocked on my door, asking if I had heard strange noises. I replied that I could, my voice barely above a whisper. He then mentioned that he was also receiving strange messages that described his every move and told him not to sleep. It felt surreal to hear confirmation that I was not alone in this. Neither of us dared to speak up or seek help. The walls themselves seemed to be listening, waiting for us to reveal our fear so it could amplify it. Hours passed in the torment of creeping fear. The house became a canvas for every nightmare scenario running through my head. I heard light tapping sound behind the wall, the floor creaking outside my door, the curtains rustling faintly even though there was no wind blowing. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers in the hallway, though I could never make out the words, just a low, unintelligible murmur that made my skin crawl. My body trembled with each wave of adrenaline. Sweat drenched the back of my shirt, but I felt cold, as if a stream of ice was licking my skin. Near dawn, the messages stopped. I didn't realize how silent my phone had been until I checked and saw that the last message had come in almost an hour ago. It simply says, "Don't think you're safe." By then, the sky was brightening to a dull gray, and weak light filtered through the thin curtains. Exhaustion weighed heavily on my eyelids, but I was too terrified to fall asleep. My colleague's door creaked, and I heard him walk out into the hallway. He said he wanted to get out of the house as soon as possible, packed his things, and left. I agreed silently, my words stuck in my throat. We packed our things in tense silence, each movement seemingly magnified in the stillness of the morning. The air is less stuffy now, but the memory of that suffocating tension is still there. Neither of us dared to thoroughly inspect every room. Instead, we made sure we had our phones, laptops, and any other essentials. The remainder can be replaced if needed. Our only goal was to leave the house and never look back. As I closed the front door behind me, I couldn't resist taking one last glance at the windows. Just for a second, I imagined I saw a glimpse of movement behind the curtains. My pulse quickened, but I said nothing. We drove out of that small town, the tires kicking up gravel and dust, the morning sunlight casting long shadows on the road. My colleagues and I tried to discuss events logically. Perhaps we had fallen victim to some elaborate prank or a local superstition. Perhaps the house is equipped with hidden cameras. However, no explanation quite explained the disturbing messages that matched our actions in real time, nor could it explain the cold presence that made every hair on my body stand on end. We reached the highway and breathed a sigh of relief. But deep inside, I know that experience will never truly leave me. Weeks later, I still found myself waking up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, convinced that my phone was vibrating with more messages. My heart pounded against my chest until I checked the screen and saw no new notifications. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was behind those messages might still be out there, watching from some dark corner, just waiting for the perfect moment to remind me that I wasn't safe. Sometimes I replay the events of that night in my head, looking for clues or plausible explanations. But the more I pondered, the stronger my suspicion that we had encountered something beyond mere surveillance or pranks. To this day, I don't know if it was a person with twisted motives or if there was something else that clung to our presence in that lonely house. All I knew was that every instinct in my body screamed that we were being toyed with by a force that fed on our fears. I still see flashes of that distorted reflection in the bathroom mirror when I close my eyes for too long. I still felt a ghostly chill wash over me as I stood alone in the dark room. And on the rare occasions I find myself in an otherwise quiet, desolate place for work, I catch myself glancing at my phone, half in fear and half expecting another text from that unknown number. The worst part is the persistent uncertainty. The person who sent those messages never asked for money or made public threats. Instead, they seem obsessed with the notion of keeping us awake, increasing our paranoia, pushing us over the edge. Its horror lies not in any explicit violence, but in the way it invades our minds, sowing seeds of doubt into our own perceptions. Even though we left that house intact, part of me feels as if I never really escaped. Every noise in the night, every flicker of a light, every inexplicable rustle of fabric in a still room now carries with it an echo of that suffocating darkness. It's a reminder that sometimes horror doesn't have to manifest itself in physical harm. Sometimes it's enough for it to observe you, learn about your fears, and make you doubt your own senses. I tried to move on, burying myself in work, convincing my colleagues that it must have been just a coincidence. However, no matter how busy we were, the memory of that night was still there, casting a shadow over every daily action. We have stayed in countless rentals since then, and nowhere have there been similar signs of malevolence. But whenever I encountered a flickering light or a slowly dripping faucet, my stomach tightened with fear. I remember how the curtains moved on their own, how the silence of the house became suffocating, how the messages knew exactly what we were doing in real time. Even now, I lock my phone away when I'm alone at night. The thought of another unknown number lighting up the screen was enough to make my hands shake. Even though all logic told me it couldn't possibly be the same presence, my instincts remained on high alert. And in those solitary moments, just before I fall asleep, I sometimes feel a faint tingling sensation on the back of my neck, as if invisible eyes were studying me from an angle I refuse to acknowledge. Deep inside, I realize the fear would probably never completely subside. It is a burden I carry with me, a reminder that there are places and forces in this world that exist just beyond our comfortable understanding. In the end, I am left with one disturbing truth. There are horrors we cannot explain, horrors that do not rely on bloodshed or overt violence. Sometimes the simplest act of observation of someone or something watching us can prove more painful than any physical threat. Because in that silent gaze, in those messages that know our every move, lies the ultimate assault on our minds. We become our own worst enemies, questioning every sound, every shadow, every flicker of light, until reality itself feels like it is unraveling. And in my case, I'm still not sure it's cleared up yet. There is no neat conclusion, no definitive answer. All I have is that gnawing doubt, the knowledge that some things still lurk in the dark long after the sun has risen. So I continue my travels, meeting new clients in new towns, always a little more alert, always glancing over my shoulder. The memory of that old house in that small town stayed with me, a permanent scar etched into my thoughts, a constant whisper of warning. Be alert, because sometimes in the stillness of the night, the phone rings for no reason. And in a heartbeat, I convince myself that it's them again, whoever or whatever they are, waiting to remind me that they never really left. I don't know if that moment will ever come, but the anticipation alone is enough to keep me awake, staring into the darkness, listening to sounds that may or may not be there. And that, in its own twisted way, was a horror I couldn't escape. There was a time when I believed that the quietest hours before dawn contained a certain solemn beauty. I was convinced that there was something almost sacred about existing in a space that is often crowded and chaotic, only to find it desolate and silent. I like the feeling of mastering the space. The silence allows me to focus completely on myself, on every movement, every breath. That's why I signed up for a membership at a 24-hour gym. The gym is located in a fairly new commercial building, equipped with modern, bright equipment. The main appeal is the flexibility. I can come anytime my erratic schedule allows, whether it's midday or the wee hours of the morning. And I quickly fell in love with those 2 or 3 a.m. workouts. No waiting in line for machines, no loud screams from people lifting weights, no strange looks. It's just me, the soft music from my headphones, and the steady sound of metal clashing. For the first few weeks, this arrangement seemed ideal. I felt like I had my own world when practicing in that large, quiet space. Until the strangeness begins to creep in subtle, almost unnoticeable signs. I remember the first time I noticed something was wrong. It was a normal night, or at least it seemed so. I arrived around 1 a.m. The automatic door made the familiar hiss as I entered the artificially lit reception area. The overhead lighting was a slightly sickly yellow, and even though the floors were spotless, I could still smell the faint scent of disinfectant that always lingered around the front desk. Normally, I would see 1 or 2 other people on the treadmill or elliptical, but that evening, the place seemed completely deserted. I put on my headphones, hoping to stay motivated for a long cardio session. When I stepped on the treadmill, I felt a slight chill. Initially, I blamed the air conditioning, which was always set too low at night. My arms prickled with goosebumps, and I shrugged it off as a trivial reaction to the cold. But there's something more than that. I felt an undercurrent in the air, a subtle tension I couldn't name. It was like the whole gym was holding its breath. Within 15 minutes, I found myself restless. Instead of the usual steady rhythm of running, I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain that I was about to spot someone lurking behind me. Of course, every time I looked, there was no one there. There was only my own faint reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors and uniform rows of machinery. The overhead light flickered once or twice, but I told myself it was just a faulty wire. By the time I finished my run, I was drenched in sweat and more tired from nervous tension than from actual exertion. The next strange event occurred a few days later. I was finishing my shoulder workout around 2:30 a.m., moving from the free weights area to the stretching area. Silence was all-encompassing, the only consistent sound being the low hum of the ventilation system pushing out that cold air. When I sat down on the mat to stretch, I heard a strange, swishing sound. It sounded like human feet dragging on a rubber floor. I stopped, my heart pounding, and scanned my surroundings. Empty again. However, the sound continued for another second or two, then stopped suddenly. When I got up to check, walked around the rows of machines, there was not a single person in sight. Part of me reasoned that maybe I heard my own footsteps echoing, or maybe some old ventilation pipe was making the noise. So I forced myself to continue, assuming it was my imagination. But it was that voice, the one that shattered all my rationalizations, that truly terrified me. It was one night a few weeks later. I was more tired than usual after working the late night shift, but still felt the urge to get in at least one short workout session. I arrived shortly after 3 a.m. The overhead lights had been dimmed by half, casting long, unsettling shadows over the weight machines. There was a strange smell wafting in the air. It reminds me of the smell of damp towels left in the corner for too long, musty, slightly sour, and not at all pleasant. I start the workout with some light cardio, then move on to a few sets of bench presses. Midway through the final round, I realized I was thirsty. My throat feels dry like sandpaper. I decided to take a short break and went to the water fountain near the men's locker room. The hallway leading there was bathed in flickering fluorescent light. The harsh light seemed to flicker against the pale tiles. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the hallway was growing longer with each step. Just as I bent down to collect the water in the bottle, I heard it, a faint whisper in Portuguese. It was unusually clear, but lacked volume, as if carried by a dying breath. 12 hoje pode entrar. Come in. That invitation, or command, whatever it was, left me dumbfounded. At first, I assumed it was another trainee calling from inside the locker room, perhaps calling out to a friend. However, that voice didn't seem right. It was like someone was speaking from a distance that was both too close and too far at the same time. Heart pounding, I stood up straight and scanned the hallway. The door to the men's locker room was slightly open, and there seemed to be no lights on inside, just the dim glow from a single bare bulb deep inside. I told myself it must have been a staff member or some other restless soul. So, taking a fumbling step forward, I softly called out hello. There was no response, but the feeling of being watched was too strong. I could almost feel eyes staring at me from dark corners. Stepping inside, I was faced with an eerie silence. The row of lockers stretched before me, and the room smelled of antiseptic mixed with old sweat. My skin crawled as I passed row after row of pews, all empty, all silent. I went to the shower area and saw that the shower stalls were empty. The entire space is deserted. Yet I couldn't shake the certainty that someone had spoken to me just moments ago. I stood there, water bottle in hand, ears straining to listen for any rustling or breathing. When nothing happened, I quickly turned around and left, feeling more uneasy than at any time I remember being in a public space. Over the following nights, I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper. It kept repeating in my mind endlessly. Sometimes I'm in the middle of a set of squats, and that phrase rings in my ears, as if someone had said it behind my back. My workout suffered because I started rushing through workouts, eager to finish and leave. But every time I tried to push the incident out of my mind, a new layer of fear enveloped me. Another disturbing incident struck like lightning about a week later. I convinced myself to deal with my insecurity by returning at my usual late hour. The place was as deserted as ever, with no sign of the night staff, although the front desk lights were still on. The whole building feels empty. I tried my best to ignore the gloom and focus on the rhythmic jingling of the weights. Midway through the exercise, the faint background music suddenly turned off, plunging the gym into silence, except for my own breathing. Then, a distortion of static crackled through the speakers, like a wet, hissing whisper. There were no clear words, but the noise had an undeniable human quality, as if layered with soft moans. The sound lasted for several seemingly endless minutes before suddenly falling silent. By then, my hands were shaking. I dropped the weights, felt my palms clammy with cold sweat, and I could taste the coppery taste of fear in my mouth. Trembling but determined not to be controlled by my own paranoia, I reasoned that I would just do a few more rounds and then leave. The feeling of a lurking presence had returned, stronger than before. Every time I turned around, I thought I saw a shape moving around the corners of the mirrored walls. My reflection seemed to lengthen and distort, as if the mirror itself was being deformed. The overhead lights flickered constantly, creating short periods of darkness that felt like a completely different world. In those pitch-black moments, I swore I saw the outlines of something more than human, shapes flickering at the edges of my vision. When I finished working out and walked toward the locker room to get my bag, every nerve in my body was on fire. The hallway leading there was colder than before, making me shiver even though my workout clothes were drenched in sweat. I put my ear close to the locker room door, not sure why I did that, and I heard faint breathing. It's gentle, it's intentional, and it makes my stomach tighten. My mind screamed to me to turn around and leave, but some grim curiosity pulled me forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the light above me went out. In complete darkness, I felt suffocated, my breath stuck in my throat. Putting my hand in my pocket, I quickly groped for my phone to use the flashlight. The weak beam of light only illuminated a small patch of floor in front of me. With every step, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like insects trapped in a jar, occasionally flashing a sickly glow that revealed lockers, benches, and sporadic glimpses. Then I saw it, a shape or a shadow. It was impossible to tell which was looming at the back of the room. The figure seemed to float, without the normal posture of a person standing on two legs. I tried to call out, but my voice betrayed me. Nothing came out except a gasp. The shadow flickered or shifted, and in a fleeting second of faint light, it seemed to disappear. I stood there, paralyzed, my heart pounding so hard that every beat echoed in my ears. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered again, illuminating the space clearly once again. The locker hallway is empty. It was an empty, ordinary locker room, as if nothing had ever been there. At that moment, I felt a strong wave of dizziness, and it took all my strength to stand. My pulse went slow, my breathing was rapid, and cold sweat covered every inch of my skin. I must have staggered out of the dressing room and hastily gathered my things from the bench near the entrance. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped my phone twice as I stuffed it back into my pocket. My only coherent thought was to get out of that building, out into the safe air of the night. The automatic door slid open painfully slowly. When I finally stepped outside, I realized I was panting as if I had just run a marathon. The freedom of open air seems fleeting. I kept looking over my shoulder on the way back to the car, convinced that something or someone was watching me from behind the dark tinted windows. In the following days, I tried to rationalize. I told myself it was stress, or my imagination had gone into overdrive in the echoing emptiness of the gym. Perhaps I was too tired, or perhaps the new supplements I was taking were causing jitters or hallucinations. But late at night, as I lay in bed, the image of that shadow and the echo of the phrase Pode, entrar haunted my thoughts. I felt trapped in a spiral of fear, and I couldn't shake the fear that there was something sinister in that place, something that thrived in the silent hours. Finally, I confided in a friend who is also a personal trainer. I avoided direct quotes as much as possible, telling him indirectly that I had experienced some deeply disturbing encounters and that I was questioning my own sanity. He offers typically logical explanations about faulty electrical systems, echo effects, and the easily influenced nature of the mind. In a polite but concerned way, he suggested that perhaps I should practice during the day, at least until I felt more comfortable. Part of me felt relieved to hear him say those things. It confirms that my rational side can still try to find normal explanations. A few weeks passed, and I mostly avoided the gym at night, opting for sessions in the afternoon or early evening. The facilities were more crowded then, filled with everyday noise and the mundane hustle of people rushing to complete their assignments. I started to feel safer. However, my schedule ended up forcing me to attend another late-night workout session. And the moment I walked through those doors, the memory of that suffocating tension came rushing back. I was always on high alert to my surroundings, listening for any strange sounds or whispers. This place is quiet in all the wrong ways. I try to keep my workout sessions short. My intention is to just do a few exercises and then leave. After finishing the last set of kettlebell curls, I tiptoed toward the hallway where the water fountain was. Even though I felt reluctant, my thirst was too strong. The sound of water trickling from the fountain sounded unusually loud, a soft metallic murmur echoing down the hallway. As I took a sip, that Portuguese phrase echoed in my mind. My heart was beating so hard that I felt a vibration in my chest. The door to the men's locker room opened again, just a crack, but the darkness behind felt like something alive, breathing. I felt a strange pull pulling me towards it, but I resisted. I turned away, refusing to let curiosity lure me inside. All the while, I had the strange feeling that someone or something was behind that door, quietly urging me to enter. A wave of disgust passed over me, and I left without returning my towel to the rack. My only intention was to escape, no matter how much of a coward I felt. Now, whenever I pass by the gym late at night, I can't force myself to go inside. Even seeing those lights glowing in the glass facade was enough to cause a tightening feeling in my chest. I kept remembering the subtle changes in the air, the static noise in the speakers, and the shapeless figure I almost walked into. Worst of all, I recall that voice that sounded both near and far, Pode, entrar. That memory was enough to send chills down my spine, and I had no rational explanation that could assuage the fear it had instilled in my mind. Sometimes I wonder if I was targeted, or if other people heard it too. Since everything happened, I haven't talked about it much, and the gym staff never mentioned anything unusual. There was almost a tacit agreement to ignore the eerie atmosphere that prevailed at night. Or perhaps no one else experienced the same level of horror as I did. I still find myself wondering if there really is an entity there, feeding on fear, or if my mind has twisted ordinary events into something horrifying. Even now, I sometimes question my own sanity. But the truth remains, I heard that whisper. I saw that figure. I had felt an oppressive presence in the darkness of that dressing room. A feeling so vivid that it could not have been just a trick of the light. My body's reaction, heart racing, hair standing on end, cold palms, was real and undeniable. That night changed me, and it left a mark on my soul that refuses to fade. I never returned to those haunting hours, never walked down that flickering hallway alone again. And even though I continued my sessions during the day, fear still lurked in the back of my mind, as if waiting to strike. The slightest malfunction of a light bulb or the faintest echo in an empty gym can make my stomach cramp with panic. I kept my guard up, half expecting and half afraid to hear that lifeless voice calling out from the locker room again, luring me into a darkness from which I might not return. The worst part is that it left me with the disturbing possibility that sometimes the darkness behind our own reflections is not empty at all. Maybe there is something there, waiting in the stillness of the early morning, inviting us deeper into the dark hallways and quiet rooms. And as I remember that creeping fear and that single chilling phrase, I know one thing. I would rather be out there in the safety of the night air than step over the threshold into that echoing void again. Perhaps it was those previous experiences, the shadow in the office, the text messages in the rented house, the whispers at the gym, that planted in me a morbid curiosity, an unconscious urge to explore abandoned places, spaces where life seemed to have retreated, leaving a space for other things to creep in. Or perhaps It's simply youth and foolish recklessness. Whatever the reason, I found myself and a few friends standing in front of the tattered chain-link fence of an abandoned industrial park one late afternoon. The air clung to us like an invisible, dense film from the moment we entered that area. Something about this place felt inherently wrong, as if it was trying to repel us even before we crossed the threshold. The jagged lines of rusted metal beams standing out against the darkening sky seemed to stand there like a silent warning. However, my friends and I could not resist the pull of our own curiosity. We naively believed we would explore, get a few thrills, and then leave. No harm done. None of us realized how deeply the heavy atmosphere and sour stench would penetrate our minds. I remember the road leading to the industrial park was cracked and pockmarked. On both sides were fields of dry grass as high as a person's head, rustling in the wind. An old chain-link fence, more holy than intact, is the only barrier between civilization and that decaying wasteland. We had heard rumors that chemicals had been processed here, but no one bothered to confirm. We just wanted an adventure. So we found a gap in the fence, squeezed through, and skirted the wasteland until we came to a giant corrugated iron building looming out of the darkness. From the outside, the warehouse was massive, its roof sagging in places, and its large doors left hanging askew on rusty hinges. When we pushed one of those doors open, it scraped across the concrete floor with a slow, painful squeak. That sound sent shivers down my spine. I remember walking in first, shining my small flashlight across the interior. The beam of light illuminated the dust particles floating in the stagnant air. The place smelled foul, old, sour, almost like old spoiled milk, but also chemical in a way that made my eyes sting. My throat feels itchy. I wanted to cough, but somehow I held back. I tried to push away the creeping fear as I waited for the others to follow. Dan, who usually makes jokes to lighten the atmosphere, was unusually quiet. I heard him mutter something about how this might not be as fun as we thought it would be. But he still wanted to continue, so we continued. The inside of the warehouse is lined with defunct conveyor belts, metal tables, and giant tanks that must have once been filled with industrial liquids. Overhead, fluorescent lights hang from bent brackets. They were no longer active, of course, but I glanced up anyway, half expecting them to flicker back to life. Instead, we only had flashlights and the occasional weak light filtering through holes in the roof. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows under the machinery were deeper than they should have been. It's as if they were absorbing light instead of reflecting it. Every time the beam of my flashlight passed through a dark corner, I felt a gentle tug of apprehension. My heart pounded loudly in my chest, and my palms grew clammy around the flashlight handle. Every little sound, the creak of metal, a single drop of water hitting the floor, echoed painfully in my ears. My breathing quickens, and I try to stay quiet so I can listen for anything else that might be lurking in the darkness. We spread out, each drawn to different areas. At one point, I ran my hand along a section of rusty pipe. The metal peeled off when I touched it, leaving an orange-brown residue on my fingers. I wiped it on my jeans, but couldn't get rid of the gritty feeling as if rust was clinging to my skin. The sour smell grew stronger as I moved closer to the center of the warehouse, where a giant machine stood there, silent and terrifying. It was covered in cracked paint, with what looked like tangled hoses growing from the sides. The floor around it was stained with something dark and greasy. In my head, I told myself it was just old chemicals, but my stomach churned with an unknown fear. Then I felt a presence, as if someone was standing right behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, my heart pounded, and a drop of cold sweat ran down my temple. I turned around, shining the flashlight in a wide arc. There was no one there. There was just a cluster of vertical containers and conveyor belts stretching into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was being silly. But the feeling was still there, as if I had trespassed on something's territory, and it was watching me from the very edge of my vision. A few meters away, a friend of mine was fiddling with the levers on a broken control panel. He muttered that these things must have operated the conveyor belts. The rest of us gathered around the machine. We exchanged looks that said maybe we should keep going. Some unspoken tension crept between us. I wonder if they feel the same pressure in the air, the silent insistence that we don't belong here. We pushed deeper into the building, stepping over piles of rubble, broken crates, metal scraps, and torn industrial tarps. The deeper you go, the heavier the atmosphere becomes. It felt harder to breathe, as if my lungs were struggling to resist a weight on my chest. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then stabilized. That was enough to send a shock of panic through me. The last thing I wanted was for the light to go out in that suffocating darkness. As we approached the back of the warehouse, we found a row of offices sealed behind glass windows. The windows were so dirty that it was impossible to see inside without wiping off the mud. I hesitated, but finally used my sleeve to create a smeared window into the darkness. The beam of my flashlight illuminated a cramped room filled with filing cabinets and a few desks, all in a state of chaos. Chairs were knocked over, drawers were pulled open, documents were scattered all over the floor. The sour smell becomes even stronger near this office area. My eyes stung and my stomach twisted. It was as if something had leaked from the walls and poisoned the air. I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flashed quickly on the other side of the glass. My breath hitched, my pulse pounded in my ears. I jerked the flashlight towards it, but nothing. There was only the ghostly reflection of our group in the dirty glass, looking much more nervous than when we first arrived. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the tingling feeling on the back of my neck. We left the office block behind, decided it was time to turn around, and headed for the exit. We were inside for less than 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. My mouth was so dry that I had to swallow constantly to keep from choking. Another friend said in a strained whisper that the odor was getting worse instead of going away. He wondered if there might have been chemicals spilled deeper in the building. Someone else suggested we leave immediately, but curiosity still fought with our insecurity. We kept going, hoping that making the complete circle would feel less like we'd run away out of fear. With every step, the feeling of being watched increases. The giant machines, silent and motionless, seemed to loom larger, as if they were alive in their own menacing way. The shadows, dense and almost tangible, seemed to vibrate with an invisible energy. My breathing became rapid, and every muscle in my body tensed. Every breath carried that acrid smell, burning my nostrils and coating the back of my throat. The hallway we entered next was lined on both sides by tall shelves that once held equipment or spare parts. Now, most of them are toppled over, their shelves empty or littered with debris. My flashlight illuminated distorted shapes that looked like they had melted, frozen into inexplicable lumps. A feeling of dread settled in the pit of my stomach, cold and unrelenting. Is this the result of some chemical reaction, or is it something else? As we approached the exit, one of us suggested we regroup and calmly walk the rest of the way without separating. We form a tight cluster, the flashlights overlapping each other to create a larger circle of illumination. Beams of light danced along the walls and ceiling, revealing streaks of rust and dirt that almost looked like spreading blood vessels. Every time we passed another rickety contraption, I strained my ears to listen for any sign of movement behind us. The silence became loud, weighing heavily on my eardrums until I wished for even the smallest, most harmless noise to break the tension. But the only sounds were our own nervous footsteps on the concrete floor and suppressed gasps. We had almost reached the large door we had entered through. The weak light from outside promises safety and normalcy. Just when we were about 10 meters from the door, a loud, shrill noise rang out from deep inside the warehouse behind us. It was a violent sound of metal hitting, like a giant machine had just collapsed or been thrown hard to the ground. The sound echoed through the vast space, bouncing off the walls and making the floor tremble slightly under our feet. We all froze for a second. Our hearts stopped beating. Then, without anyone telling anyone, we started running. Pure panic took over. We rushed towards the light, towards the slightly open door, not daring to look back. The sound of our footsteps pounding on the concrete, mixed with the sound of our hearts beating frantically in our chests. The feeling of being chased became intense, tangible, as if the darkness and decay of the place itself were reaching out to grab us. We rushed out of the warehouse, not stopping until we were back on the cracked dirt road, panting, eyes wide with terror. We looked at each other, our faces pale under the fading sunset. No one said anything for several minutes. There was only the sound of our panting and the rustling of dry grass in the wind. As we slipped through the fence back into the outside world, I glanced back one last time. The giant warehouse stood there, silent and black in the gathering darkness. I saw no movement, heard no other sounds. But that foul, sour smell still seemed to follow us, a tangible reminder of the decay and fear we had just escaped. We never talked much about what happened that night. There was no reasonable explanation for that loud noise, nor for the feeling of being watched, and the atmosphere was so stuffy that it was difficult to breathe. It's simply another experience to add to the collection of strange, unsettling things that always seem to find me in forgotten places. And so, the pieces of fear kept piling up. Office building with lanky shadow. Rented house with know-it-all messages. Late-night practice room with stray whispers. The industrial area is devastated with rotten breath and horrifying noises. They are like separate chapters in a book that I never want to finish. Is there some invisible thread that ties it all together? Was it the same presence that followed me from place to place? Or am I simply someone sensitive to the lingering echoes of places where sadness, despair, or something worse once reigned? I don't have the answer. Maybe never. What I do know is that those experiences changed me. Silence no longer brings a sense of peace. It becomes a void waiting to be filled by unwanted noises. Flickering lights aren't just a sign of old electricity. It is a reminder of those moments when reality seems fragile. A strange phone number appeared on the screen, making my heart clench. A shadow at the edge of my vision startled me. True horror is not always in what we see or hear. Sometimes it lies in uncertainty, in unanswered questions, in the feeling that there are other laws at work just beneath the surface of our familiar world. It lies in the way these experiences gnaw at our confidence in our own senses, making us doubt reality. And that's why I tell you these stories at night in the silence. Not to scare you to sleep, but to remind you that the world is bigger and more mysterious than we think. Let these vague fears, these echoes from the darkness, maybe somehow become a strange background music, lulling you into your dreams. Because sometimes, facing the darkness in a story helps us feel safer in the darkness of our own rooms. Close your eyes, relax, listen to the silence. And if you hear a strange noise, a faint whisper, or feel an invisible gaze, maybe, just maybe, it's just an echo of my story. Or maybe no. Good night and dream peaceful dreams.